All right, let's jump right into this explainer and uncover the incredibly traumatic, real-life obsession behind one of the absolute most famous poems in the English language. We're looking at a piece of literature that has literally resonated across generations. It's a poem that completely captures the bitter sting of rejection, but also the enduring power of devotion. And you know what? It's honestly a masterclass in brilliant, maybe even a little petty, psychological manipulation, using beautiful poetry as a literal weapon of unrequited love. So today we're unpacking W.B. Yeats' masterpiece, When You Are Old, and we're going to see how the deepest heartbreaks so often forge the sharpest artistic blades.
Now, before we get into the history and the text itself, I really want you to ask yourself, what would you say to the one who got away? It's an agonizing, universally understood feeling, right? But it is the exact emotional trigger that fueled our subject today. Like, how do you express this intense, lingering emotion to someone who simply doesn't feel the same way? For most of us, well, we just move on, or maybe carry a quiet regret. But for a literary genius, the answer was to write something so profoundly devastating and so incredibly beautiful that it would echo through the centuries, basically ensuring that the person who walked away would never, ever forget what they left behind.
Section 1. The Modern Poetry Pioneer.
To actually fully appreciate this poem, we need to understand the towering figure at the center of our story, a man who became an absolute pivotal force in 20th century literature. Born in 1865 and educated in Dublin, William Butler Yeats is just a fascinating study in unexpected greatness. Now, what I find kind of incredibly encouraging based on our source material is that Yeats was actually a completely average student at school. Seriously. Yet, from those humble academic beginnings, he emerged as a true pioneer of modern poetry. And he wasn't just, writing in isolation in some dusty room. He was a massive driving force behind the Irish literary revival, literally reshaping his country's cultural identity. Along with luminaries like Lady Gregory, he even founded the famous Abbey Theatre, serving as its chief and really guiding the theatrical voice of a nation during some of its most crucial formative years.
But what is genuinely fascinating about Yeats is his deeply complex mind. He wasn't just interested in standard verse or politics. Oh no. From his youth, he cultivated this deep, intense fascination with Irish legend, mysticism, and the occult. In fact, our source notes he was famously known for raising the ghosts. And this wasn't just some quirky weekend hobby. This deep connection to spirituality, seances, and the unseen world would eventually form the absolute bedrock of how he viewed love and the human soul. Because think about it, if you believe that the physical world is just a shadow of a grander, spiritual reality, which Yeats absolutely did, well, it makes perfect sense that your poetry wouldn't just focus on superficial beauty. You'd be looking for something way deeper, an eternal spirit that survives long after youth fades.
And that beautifully sets up a really surprising fact about his career trajectory. Usually, an artist reaches their absolute creative peak, they produce their magnum opus, and then they get awarded the highest honor. Well, Yeats was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1923. But get this, he is widely considered one of the very few writers whose universally recognized greatest works were actually completed after receiving that ultimate honor. Major monumental works like The Tower in 1928 and The Winding Stair in 1929 came in the twilight of his career. It poses such a fascinating question about aging, doesn't it? As his physical body grew older, his emotional depth, forged by decades of yearning and loss, only grew richer and more profound. It fueled a creative fire that just completely refused to burn out.
Section 2. The Revolutionary Muse. So what exactly drove him to create such intensely emotional art, sustaining that creative fire for all those decades? Well, it all comes down to the woman who captured his imagination and utterly refused to let it go. You see, Yeats suffered from a massive soul-crushing case of unrequited love. The object of his absolute obsession was a woman named Maud Gonne. Now, she wasn't just some passive figure of beauty, she was a fiery, incredibly active Irish revolutionary. And the tragic reality for Yeats, she simply never responded to his love. Just picture the juxtaposition here. Him, the brooding, yearning poet steeped in mysticism, and her, a fierce political activist entirely consumed by the fight for Irish independence. She was his beloved, his ultimate muse, but those feelings were entirely a one-way street. However, as the source points out, this unrequited love didn't just fade into a quiet disappointment. No, it found its ultimate expression, becoming the very engine for many of his most intensely emotional and famous poems.
Section 3. A Future Command.
To cope with this profound rejection, Yeats didn't just write a sad, traditional love letter begging for her affection. Instead, he deployed a fascinating psychological and literary tactic, the future command. Our speaker dramatizes his unrequited love by completely refusing to beg in the present moment. Instead, he speaks to his beloved from an imagined distant future, instructing her on exactly what she will do and exactly how she will feel years down the line. It's a remarkably powerful way of reclaiming agency in a dynamic where, let's be honest, he practically had none. It is, in a way, placing a gorgeous, lyrical curse of future regret right upon her.
Let's walk through exactly how he structures this brilliant command. First, he projects her far into the future, imagining her old and gray and full of sleep. Then, he specifically commands her to take down his published book of poems. I mean, think about the sheer irony here. He writes a book largely inspired by her, only to instruct her to read it when she's old, lonely, and vulnerable. He wants her, in her twilight years, to read his words and finally comprehend the sheer magnitude of the love she threw away. He leaves absolutely no stone unturned to convince his beloved that his devotion came from the deepest, most permanent parts of his heart, way beyond the fleeting physical charms that just naturally fade with time.
Section 4. Loving the Pilgrim's Soul. All right, let's actually look at the text from his collection, The Rose, to see this absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation and genuine devotion unfold. Listen to how he beautifully, yet kinda hauntingly, sets the scene in this first stanza. When you are old and gray and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. The diction here is just stunning. Nodding by the fire evokes this desperate need for physical warmth, which creates this brilliant contrast with the cold reality of her aging in isolation. He's literally asking her to slowly read and remember her own lost youth, essentially forcing her to confront her own mortality. He's positioning his poetry as the only mirror left that will reflect her former glory.
So the crucial point arrives right here in the second stanza. How many loved your moments of glad grace, and loved your beauty with love, false or true, but one man loved the pilgrim soul in you. Here we see this completely fascinating mix of utter arrogance and unmatched devotion. He dramatically separates himself from literally every other man who ever pursued her. He openly acknowledges, sure, she had a multitude of suitors, but he systematically devalues all of their affection, dismissing every other lover she has ever had as completely superficial compared to him.
He creates this stunning visual and emotional contrast for the reader, and this brings us to the very core of this masterpiece. While others loved her moments of glad grace, meaning her superficial external beauty and physical charms, he alone loved her inner essence. He loved the pilgrim soul in her. Now, remember our earlier discussion about his mysticism. This ties everything together perfectly. A pilgrim is someone on a long, arduous journey for spiritual reasons. Our source beautifully describes this as an elegance of spirituality. Yeats is arguing that he didn't just love her face, he loved her wandering, searching essence. His love absolutely transcends the standard parameters of physical attraction. It's a profound, spiritual connection anchored in the very depths of his heart.
Which brings us to a powerful and honestly somewhat tragic realization as we wrap up our explainer today. Maud Gonne never returned his feelings. She remained the fierce revolutionary, and he remained the yearning poet. The great irony is that her wandering pilgrim soul kept her forever moving away from him, yet his unyielding love for that exact soul anchored his greatest work. That very rejection, her stubborn refusal to reciprocate, gifted the world this timeless lyric of intense emotion. It leaves us to ponder this final question. Does the greatest art always require the deepest heartbreak?